I know people are just sort of jumping on, but I'm really excited about today's session. I know you're going to get started here in a moment, Melissa, but what a fascinating environment as we've seen with some of the geopolitical issues that are going out there, rising interest rates, concerns about inflation. A lot to talk about today, Robin, as we talk about fuel, right? Oil. I mean, I know that's not on the
I
behavioral
went to go get
science side of
gas the
things.
other day. I don't get gas. I don't drive that much anymore. I was like, what the, where have I been that it
Oh
went
yeah,
like,
yeah.
it was like double. And I don't even like usually pay attention. And I was like, I looked at it twice. I was like, holy shit.
But the bigger concern is actually one of the bigger concerns is diesel because a lot of farmers and people that do manufacturing use diesel. So the
Oh,
cost of diesel is exponential. So you just see this significant rise in costs across the place. And consumers are just, and that's kind of part of the topic I know we're going to talk about today, is some of the anxiety and fear that consumers fear and some of the reluctance, which is rather fascinating and interesting. So but I think we're kind of getting all revved up here. Melissa, we'll
Yep.
kind of start with you, right? I guess we'll get started.
Yep. So just want to say good morning and thank you for being with us on the second part of our webinar series brought to us by the SMC. Today we're going to talk about shifting the conversation. So gear up for that. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you to our SMC annual sponsors who make this possible. We have Brookfield Residential, Casa Fresca Homes, Homes by West Bay, Lennar, Lake Michigan Credit Union, Meritage Homes, Toll Brothers, and Pulte Group. So I will turn it over to Nathaniel Bittman with Hancock Whitney. He will be our moderator, and then obviously welcome Dr. Robin Levitch.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Appreciate that. Thank you to all of us, all of you that are joining us today, and we appreciate that. The topic of today, myself and Dr. Lavich are going to speak a little bit here, and Dr. Robin Lavich is a coach and a mentor of mine for many, many years, and we both specialize in the subject matter of what we like to call behavioral science, but that tends to be a little bit of a boring topic, right? We're going to go a little bit deeper. We're going to be talking about some topics here that are related specifically to you. But Dr. Lavich is the owner and the coach and the consultant and the trainer for Surpass Your Goals, and we're excited to have her here today to kind of share some really important tactics on how do we purpose a conversation, how do we make proper connections, and how do we overcome the anxiety. We all know out there that you're in your model centers. We understand, we see where builder sentiment is at, we see where consumer sentiment is at. We understand that there are some homes that are sitting around a little bit longer, and we know that consumers are facing some anxiety and fear about making decisions. And we've heard multiple times before that sometimes you have consumers that come in the model center and sometimes they just want to lead with incentive and price, where in the past they may have been more connected and more emotional about coming into your model center and feeling that wow factor, that enjoyment, that emotional connection that consumers make by buying something new, like a new car or a new shirt or a new search or a new suit, or obviously a new home, something significant that's so life-changing. So we want to move the conversation now over to Dr. Lavich. She talks a little bit about some of the things that happen there and how do we create trust, and Dr. Lavich, how do we work through some of the anxieties that consumers are facing today? We kind of opened up with just some of the geopolitical issues and how much of that really has a significant impact in consumers having trust when they're going in to make a life-changing decision.
nice. I'm delighted to be here. Happy you're here, Nathaniel, because I'm going to talk about the neuroscience and the emotional part, and then Nathaniel is going to be my wingman and help convert that for you all in terms of the buyer and what that looks like in terms of practicality. So this will be really, really good. We're going to talk today about connection that converts. And so what we're wanting to do is move from transactions to actually building trust. And this is a three-part series, basically moving from price to possibility when we're talking about buyers. The first one that we did was about reading the room and kind of emotional intelligence so that you could be in a position to understand when people were in anxiety and when they were experiencing fear. Today, we're going to do transaction to trust. And then the third one next month is going to be hesitation to commitment. And so the first one was kind of the context, and I'll do a quick recap today in terms of like the emotional framework and the neuroscience. Today is how do we actually shift people? And then the third one is going to be the most practical of all three, where we kind of bring all of it home. Today, as I mentioned, we'll do a quick recap. I'm going to talk about the neuroscience specifically of trust. I'm going to give you a model on the trust continuum and then practical strategies on how to move people from that fear, from that anxiety into the trust. So, quick recap. the points from the first webinar is emotional intelligence is about reading others, but also managing ourselves. Buyers mirror the energy that we put forth. And if you come in with this pressure to make the sale, they feel that pressure and then they respond with a sense that they have to protect themselves. And so, what I want to do today is help you recognize that your state, you have to become aware of your state as well as their state. And if they're in a protection mode, how do you actually get them out of the protection mode? When we look at the brain is wired to avoid threats and seek rewards. So if you put this in the context of a buyer conversation, if somebody is in protection mode where they're trying to eliminate particular threats, you're going to have a much harder time trying to sell them. So ultimately, what we're doing in terms of the neuroscience is we're moving them from the amygdala, which is this primitive threat response, into the prefrontal cortex. And when we shift the brain from protection to possibility or distrust to trust, it literally activates different parts of the brain. And so I'm not necessarily going to give you the science of what's going on with the brain, but I'm going to give you the strategies, and you just have the understanding that it's impacting the brain, which is why it actually works. So when we look at the brain is automatically scanning constantly for what's safe, what's unsafe. Whereas if there's uncertainty, there's a sense of having to protect themselves and they get focused on price. If there's a sense of safety, they naturally expand, and then the thought process moves to vision and possibility. So the brain is scanning, the nervous system is also scanning. And so what's happening is the buyers aren't necessarily picking up on what you say, but they're kind of picking up on what you emit, what energy you're putting forth. So if you're rushed, uncertain, needy, negative, grounded versus grounded, clear, calm, or confident, unconsciously or subconsciously, they're picking up on that energy and how you're interacting with them. They're basically able to deduce, do I trust this person or do I not trust this person? So your energetic state transfers long before your words do. And the last thing we covered in the last webinar was that ultimately the emotions are what are driving decisions. So we like to think that we make logical decisions, but the emotion comes in first, and then we end up using logic to justify our decision. But basically, it's the emotion that's triggering that. So we did a little bit of an overview. This was in the last webinar where we talked about the different emotions and what thoughts and what responses you'll have if somebody is experiencing those emotions. And so the takeaway from the last session was basically read the room. So you want to, when you're dealing with a buyer, you want to recognize the emotion. You want to go deeper to what is their real fear, what is the underlying concern. You want to acknowledge that with that person so they feel heard. And there's a typo. There's always at least one. And then you want to have a direct response. I have worked very hard not to not to fall apart and be a perfectionist. I'm a recovering perfectionist, so I'm quite impressed with myself that I didn't even have a threat response with a typo. That's progress. Anyway, so then we make a direct response in terms of how we're going to interact with people. And that direct response today, those conversations is what we're going to dig into. So if the brain is scanning for safety, threat, connection, and certainty, what we want to be aware of is the conversations that we have with people are actually creating electrical currents. So when we look at what's going on with the body, there's electrical impulses and there's also chemical impulses. And we have trillions of cells. So when we're interacting with people, there is an actual exchange of energy, whether we're aware of it or not. If somebody is in a protective mode, that's an energy current of strong negative energy. And so, again, if you're in that state of being rushed, just wanting to make the sale, maybe you're annoyed, that's coming across, whether you're intending to it or not. People's bodies and their brains are picking up on this. So, trust is emotional before it's logical. People feel safe before they can actually analyze it. So what's happening is people are unconsciously asking, can I trust you? Do you get me? Do you understand me? Am I safe making this decision? Are you trying to sell me or are you trying to support me? And I just want you to consider for a moment, they might not be aware that that's what they're thinking, but what their body and what their brain is assessing is this somebody that I can trust? Is this somebody that gets me? Is this somebody that we're in sync with? And if it doesn't feel like it's in sync, sometimes we can't put our finger on why. We just know that it just feels like a miss or it feels like an ick, like something is just off. You're going to have a much harder time trying to sell somebody when you don't actually have that synergy. So if you want to think about it just for a moment, a time where you just met somebody and you just immediately trusted them, or a time that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in a sales conversation. It could be, a friend, a networking situation, whatever. And a time you immediately distrusted somebody else. And you can't necessarily put your finger on why that is, but you can tell that it created a feeling within you. And if you become aware of what's going on, when you trust somebody, you actually lean in, right? You actually want to pull that energy together. It becomes magnetic. And when you distrust somebody, you actually feel repelled by them and like pulled away. And so I'm going to teach you how to spot a little bit of that body language so you can sense whether they're in a state of trust or whether they're in a state of distrust. Ultimately, trust is not built from information. It is not about you giving the perfect information or having the perfect formula or saying the right thing. Trust is built from an emotional safety. It is the energetic current on how they feel being around you. So if the buyer feels safe, what ends up happening in terms of their thought process, how they end up making decisions, is they go into a space because different parts of the brain are activated. They go into a space that's far more creative. They're open, they're trusting, they're collaborative, they're more attentive and engaged. They start imagining possibilities, and there's an ease where you feel like you're in sync. Now, I want you to consider not necessarily a buyer situation, but imagine leadership where you have certain leaders where you feel comfortable or certain people that you feel comfortable around. There is a co-creation that ends up happening where you are working together as a team. But if it's somebody that you don't feel safe with, you have a tendency to want to shut down. So you end up withdrawing, you become skeptical, you start asking excessive questions, you delay decisions. Maybe you become controlling where you want all the answers, or you just emotionally shut down. If you're selling, new home, what you want is them to be in a creative space. You want them to start imagining what it would look like, how they would decorate it, how, what they would get, what the layout would be like. That is all creative energy. And they can't access that creative energy if they feel unsafe and there's a sense of distrust. I feel you, Nathaniel. What you got? I can see the energy
Well,
shift.
there's actually a couple of things I just want to point out as you kind of go. But when you mention the energy that is when a buyer comes in to a model center, we talked about this on the last webinar, and I want to reemphasize this again. Obviously, if you're in a model center, you're a salesperson, there are multiple different families there. Maybe you're in the process of writing up a contract. Maybe you're trying to get questions answered with one party, but then another party comes in and you're feeling stress and anxiety. In many cases, can you kind of emphasize that? Because in many cases, Robin, you might have people in a model center or they're showing a home, but there could be multiple people at one time that are wanting to look at a unit. So can you just talk about this environment? Because we're in such a fast-paced environment where everybody wants information so quickly, right? Either through social media or they want to be attended to very, very fast. How does somebody kind of manage that environment?
That's a good question and a kind of a layered question. So the first thing we want to look at is if the external environment, meaning the environment that you're in is busy and there's lots of people, and you have to make sure that you're not fragmented. And what I mean by that is just think about being distracted. Think about somebody who's texting and driving. That level of distraction plummets your performance. So the question then becomes, how do you actually become present even though there's all these different things coming in? And the easiest way to do that, if you're making eye contact with somebody and you're connecting with somebody, there's nothing worse. If you think about like going into a restaurant, right? And it's a really busy day and the hostess comes up and they don't take the moment to actually look at you or make eye contact or say hello, but they're rushing you along, it feels disjointed. And it only takes a second to actually get present and connect with that person. So you can manage all kinds of different people by managing your own presence and making sure that you're connecting with each individual. I had a client that was a realtor, and she had a second baby, and she felt like there was this constant pull of which child to give attention to. So when she was giving attention to the baby, it was like she felt like she was neglecting the other child, and she was feeling guilty about how to navigate that. And I understood that, but at the same time, we have a sense that in order to connect with somebody, it's contingent on time. It is not. It is contingent on presence. My dog does this new thing. I don't know why she does this, but when I'm doing these slides, I'm sitting on the couch, and I have French doors that overlook the lanai. So she goes outside, and then she stares at me through the window to try to get my attention. And then when I finally notice her, and then that's her cue. She can come in and actually get some attention. And I find it hilarious because she's tiny. So if I'm on the couch, I can't see her. So she positions herself just so I can see her, and then I can give her attention. Now, that moment of giving her that attention is seconds, to create that connection, and she comes running in. So the same is true with the client with the two kids. She doesn't have to block off an evening with her one child to create quality time. She needs to connect in that moment so the child feels seen, and it takes seconds. So in a model home, it doesn't matter how many people are there, it takes seconds to create that connection or to disrupt it. You're on mute. No, now you're on mute. Something happened.
That's okay. I was just saying,
There we go.
thank you for pointing that information out. That was really clear in terms of just making sure that someone is making those proper connections. And if somebody, depending on their disc profile, if they're kind of a fast-paced person, I'm glad you pointed out the fact that time is not the relevant piece, because sometimes people may feel rushed to make that connection, because if they're a high dominant style person, they may just really just try to touch everybody very, very quickly. So thank you
Yeah,
for
the connection is not high. The connection is eyeball to eyeball. I see you. You don't even have to say hi. You don't even need any words. You just make the connection with your eyes, with your energy, with your body. So people don't make major decisions when they feel emotionally unsafe. I'm going to go through a framework for you. There's a program I went through called Conversational Intelligence. It talks about the neuroscience of conversations and trust. Really unfortunate. She passed away, but it was a brilliant program. And years ago, when I started getting involved in neuroscience, this just changed the game for me. So I want to share this with you. This is the conversational intelligence dashboard. It looks a little busy, but I'm just going to break it down for you. If you look at this as a continuum, on the left-hand side, we have protection and distrust. And on the right-hand side, we have partnership and trust. Protection and distrust is activating the amygdala, the threat response. Partner and trust is activating the prefrontal cortex. So this is how trust is actually built in, hardwired into our body and into our brain. When we're moving somebody out of distrust into trust, people go through different states. When we're at level 1, and I'm going to do a deeper dive into this, but when we're at level 1, we're often just providing information and telling people or asking questions, but it's very, very transactional. That puts people either in a resistant state or a skeptical state. That is not a buying state. That is not a creative state. That is not a possibility state. That is not a connection state. That is, I am going to protect myself at all costs. And it feels tense. If you get to the point where you're going to advocate for them and you're going to inquire, that puts them into like a wait and see mode. But it's still not trust. They're not actively resisting, but they're also not actively engaging. They're just like, meh, middle of the road. Where we want to get to people is the third level, which is where we end up. really sharing with people and discovering. That becomes transformational. Then people start experimenting and they start co-creating. That only happens, that level of conversation only happens when there's trust. So what that looks like, if we go to level one becomes very transactional, right? You're telling people, you're giving information. There's a focus on what can we get from each other. This isn't just in a sales conversation. I see this it's everywhere. It's how we show up in connection with people. Do we come from the perspective of, are you going to meet my needs? Are you going to do what I want? Are you going to give me what I want? What do you want from me? That's all transactional. That there's no lovey-dovey in any of that. What that looks like from the salesperson when they're in transactional is they have a tendency to overtalk. They jump or push the solutions too quickly. They might interrupt people, and they have a sense of like, okay, I have to handle the objections. This is the formula. And then they start focusing on logic and features. A transactional relationship is cold. There is no sense of warmth. There is no sense of connection. It is as cold as it's going to get. If you think about transactional from a bank perspective, you go in to make a transaction, you give them a slip to either, put in money or take out money. And what they're trying to do is shift it so that it's more community based and people oriented. So instead of it just being a transaction where you're exchanging a piece of paper, they actually talk to you, they actually get to know you, they actually get to know your name. But it's because people will bank where they feel seen and heard more than a transaction. And you'll see all kinds of advertisements that try to shift the marketing away from transactional into transformational. If you're in level one, you're going to get resistance and skepticism from the buyer. And it feels yucky. It feels tense. It feels like you're getting nowhere. And yeah, it just doesn't mesh at all. So that's transactional. I knew it. I can't hear you again.
Claire, you can't hear me?
There you go.
Okay, thank you. A clarification question for you, which is important because you said something that I think is really, really, and I just want to make sure I heard it correctly. We in sales, when we talk about Socratic selling, we are generally taught for decades now that we should be asking questions. You mentioned something about somebody walked through the door and you start to ask a lot of questions that can make somebody feel very tense. I'm one of those individuals that if I walk to a place, could be anywhere, could be a car lot. I was recently at an open house with a realtor, a very good one. And as buyers were coming through the door who are facing fears in an open house, this is an existing home, that individual sales agent was asking a lot of personal questions. And you could tell by the body language of the individuals, it didn't matter their style. They were very resistant to answer any questions. And I'm one of those. If you ask me lots of questions, I feel very defensive. It shuts me down immediately. But in sales, you hear a lot about that. Don't talk, ask questions. Did I hear you correctly when you were saying sometimes in level one, that could create a level of immediate distrust? Because I certainly feel that way when it happens to me.
Yeah, so when I get to some of the practical stuff, I'm going to talk about, and I'll give you some tips on the types of questions to actually ask to engage in those conversations. But what's happening at that moment is you're being taught, ask the questions. Just think about this for a minute. So the same thing happens when they train coaches. The whole coaching model is about asking questions. So a new coach comes in and they become fixated on what's the right question. And so the client is talking and the coach is in their head thinking, well, what's the right question to ask? What's the next question that I should ask? And there's no connection there because the person is in their head thinking, what's the right question? And a lot of times when I work with people, whether it's in sales or any other type of communication, they want a formula. Like, what do I say? What's the script? I was going to say something very vulgar. You don't need a script, right? You need connection because it is not the words that people are going to feel. It is the emotion. So if you're in your head or you're following a formula and you're following a script of this is what I'm supposed to do, there is zero presence, which means you're not going to create safety. You're not going to create connection. Is not about a checklist of these are the questions I have to ask. To your point, if you feel them pulling back, stop. Like your job is to recognize first and foremost, are we in coherence, right? Are we in sync or not? And if we're not in sync, nothing else you do is going to matter until you get that person comfortable. I was very passionate about that one.
That was perfect. Thank you. That really clarifies a lot. Thank you.
Now, this is where most salespeople are trained, which is level two. Level two is positional. Positional is where you're exchanging information, there's surface rapport, and you're professional. You want to be very polite, you want to be very professional. It's like managing your image. And so the salesperson is gathering information. They don't want to get too much into the emotions and the messy stuff, so they stay detached and they're professional, but it's not deeply connected. Level two positional isn't distrust, but it's also not trust. It puts you in that guarded and wait and see. So now the person is like, can I really trust you? I'm not really sure. And so they're kind of on the fence. We want them off the fence, but we're trained that we need to be professional. We need to give them the information. We think that that's how we're creating trust is by showing them that we have the information, that we have the resources, that we can offer the support. But we're doing that on a very surface level. And so that doesn't end up resonating with the brain and the nervous system. It doesn't trigger them, it doesn't activate a threat response, but it doesn't create that cohesiveness either. So what we want to do is move them into the third level, which is transformational. Transformational, and the way I like to look at it is if we're talking about an electrical current, an energy exchange, it's a transmission. So the transaction is very cut, and a transmission is this flow of energy where you end up being in sync. The focus then shifts from I need to be professional, I need to see how I show up, to let's share, let me understand where this person is coming from. And the entire intention shifts from me to you. And then you start participating in active listening, empathy, validation. You can spot what their emotional attunement is, what their concerns are. And then you get into collaborative problem solving. Once you understand what they value, what's important to them, what their concerns are, the entire conversation shifts. But if you're coming from this professional stance of these are the things that I need to hit on, these are the things I need to make sure that I cover, you're not in tune with what they're saying they need. So when you move into transformational where you're connected with what they need, you're of service to what they need, they start experimenting, they start co-creating. And so you start hearing conversations like, oh, we could do this, or you know what would be really nice, or I hadn't thought about this. This would be a good idea. Everything opens up. And the reason why this was so important for me as a coach is I can't coach somebody from a threat response. Like as a coach, my job is to help you create a vision and a path to actually achieve your goals. Well, you're never going to create a vision in a threat response. So every conversation was how do I get the brain shifted from whatever they had going on in their day to co-creating, to looking at what's possible and then expanding into that and then having creative problem solving. So that's the model that we're shifting towards, but it may be very different than what people are being trained on, which is this script, these questions, this formula. It connect with the energy first and foremost. The words, the scripts, the language, all of that will fall into place when the energy is in alignment. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody that you don't even remember what you said? I remember, I don't know if this is good or bad, but I remember this one time this woman came up to me. I saw her at some kind of event and she was like, I remember you from years ago. You did this training. I think it was actually on disc. And she goes, it was so good. And then she was just like giving me all kinds of accolades. And of course I wanted to know, well, what training is it? I have all kinds of dozens of trainings. And I go, what was the training? She couldn't remember. She couldn't remember what the training was, but she remembered how she felt in the training. And that's the key is when we create that connection with people, they'll always remember the sentiment, the emotion, the connection more than the actual specifics or the language. Any thoughts on that, Nathaniel? I love when I spark your insight and I can see the wheels going. That means I gave you information you didn't have. It's new.
Well, I mean, you're touching on a subject matter that I think is in everybody's mind, right? Is as you're talking about making that connection, keeping the energy wave and the feeling of the emotion, right? I always relate it to cars. I could go in and look to purchase a vehicle, and if I have a salesperson who really connects very strongly with me, it's going to make the experience much more easier. So I may have the propensity to spend a little bit more or go into a price bucket or do something that I don't want to get into just because we've created that trust. And it's such a short-lived period of time, right? You buy, you're gone, and then you never talk again. It's amazing how the body works. But you're right. I remember the last time I bought a vehicle, and I just remember more so than anything else. I don't remember the number of cars. I don't remember the process. I just remember the experience and the conversation with the salesperson.
Yeah, I go and I get my hair done, and it's usually it's an ordeal. There's a lot of layers, there's a lot of colors. And when I first went to the hairdresser, she was like, "Well, we can do highlights, we can do lowlights, we can do this." And in my head, I'm adding up the price ticket because my hair is not cheap. And in that moment, I remember in that first conversation, again, I don't remember what she said, but I remember feeling she's not trying to upsell me. I trust her. And so whatever recommendation she would make, I was like, okay, sounds good. And there's times where I go in and she goes, you don't need all of that this time. Let's just do this. She's always doing what I need and not what's going to give her, more money or a bigger tip. And I can't tell you what happened in that first interaction, but I remember going in with, oh, she's just trying to upsell me. And then that immediately flipped. And I remember thinking, oh no, I trust her. Like she's not trying to do that. I don't know how I knew that. I just knew that. And now I don't question it. You can't hear you again.
I think so much of this relates back to what we talked about initially, which is segment one, and now in this one. If you're driving into work and you had a really bad morning and you're stressed out, maybe things are happening, God forbid, if you spill coffee or whatever, things are just kind of in shambles, they're all over the place, and your frame of mind is an energy wavelength that's somewhere other than where it needs to be. People are going to feed that. They're going to understand that. They're going to feel that. So I think we're always going to go back to this series to say people have to basically be self-aware to make some of these techniques work. It always goes back to the individual. We think it's what questions we need to ask of that person. How do we get them into a state where they become a little bit more vulnerable with us? But the reality is it really does start with us.
The perfect summary, because the reason I started the first session on you got to know how you are first, because if you're going to move somebody into trust, you can't be in a threat response. So if you're stressed out and you're in a threat response, you're never going to be able to shift somebody else out of it. You have to first be able to shift yourself, get calm, so their nervous system can register safety, and then you can shift the conversation. If you're trying to do it from a formula, but you're stressed, you got 101 things on your mind and whatever, no, it doesn't work. You can think it works. It's like people telling me, like, oh, I'm really good at compartmentalization. So if they get in a fight with their spouse and they go to work, they can separate the two. Bullshit. Everybody in the office knows when you're fighting with somebody else. You might not be vocalizing it, but we can all feel something's off. And so it all starts with us. Good summary, Nathaniel. So when we're having the conversation, and this just ties into everything we're talking about, your intention matters. And I want you to really consider this. If your intention is focused on the formula, the right thing to say, how to make the sale, that's never going to lead to coherence and trust. The intention must be, I want to connect, I want to understand. If you come from a frame of mind of, this is how I have to be, or this is how I can get you, people pick up on it. If the intention is pure, I just want to understand, it relaxes, it just eases people. And so if you go in with the intention of, I just want to be able to connect, I call it high intention, low attachment. High intention is I'm going to show up in full presence and we'll see what ends up happening. And more often than not, a high intention where you're fully present, you're going to get the outcome you want. But if you go in with the attachment of the outcome you want, then the intention becomes very pushy and very desperate. So first and foremost, our intention. Go ahead.
A puzzling question here. So we talk about intention. Somebody had asked this question before, and it was after our last segment. They said, if somebody's coming in to a model center, their intention is to buy, right? They're typically, I mean, they could be window shopping, but generally you're not always really window shopping if you're looking to buy a significant purchase like a home, not like a shirt. So if the intention is, I want to come in and buy, and let's assume that the advocate on the other end that's receiving that person coming into the model center is high energy, everything is good, they're checked in, they're under control, their breathing is right, everything is in balance. Can we talk about that intention part? Aren't you somewhat a little bit ahead of the game because the consumer's intention when they're walking through the door is to buy? Because I've heard the opposite narrative. Someone's walked in and they felt like they were being neglected and didn't get answers, or nobody even approached them from the model center. So it's kind of confusing. When do you know to turn on the sales stuff and when do you know not to turn on the sales stuff?
This is
Is
going to
that a
be a
fair
very
question?
unpopular answer. Never turn on the sales stuff because
Okay.
the sales stuff is the intention of I got to close the sale and it feels yucky. If the intention is I want to connect and I trust that the connection leads to the sale, you don't need all that other stuff.
That's a great point. I'm glad you emphasized that because I think a lot of people's mindsets are, even in open houses, right? Doesn't matter. Open houses, model centers, doesn't matter. You walk onto something or you're walking into something, people on the other end have the intention of, because they're not soliciting the person to come in. That person's coming in. So you kind of feel like maybe you have a little bit of the advantage because why are you here if you're not intending to buy, right? And
But
then
I
maybe you have more of
guess
a high dominant.
But that's the question, right? Like if you set the intention as the salesperson, like why are you here? You're coming from a space of curiosity and wanting the connection. If you
Mm.
make the assumption, well, you're coming in, so you want the information and you're ready to buy, you're putting an assumption and where they are in their sales cycle, and you're trying to go for the close. I don't know why they might come in. I mean, it could be any number of reasons, but the intention is different if you come from why versus, oh, I already know. And so if we come from why, then we're already leaning into like, help me understand. So here's some things, some practical tools that fit right into that. You're always spot on, Nathaniel. First is how we're listening. I have done an entire session on listening. And people talk about active listening and all this different kind of stuff, but if we're listening and we're already thinking, what's the next question I have to ask, or how do I get them to this point? We're no longer listening in the present. And if we're going to talk about energy and connection, why not listen for the connection and the emotion and the energy and not their words? So if I'm meeting with a client and I start the session and I say, how are you doing? And I usually get that's the first response I get is this big sigh and this big exhale. And then every once in a while they might say something like, well, it's not bad. And meanwhile, they just exhaled as if they haven't exhaled all week. I'm listening for the whole energy, not just the words, because a lot of times we don't actually know how we're doing. So your job is to listen deeper. Your job is to listen to what is the underlying concerns, what's important to them, how are they feeling, are they in trust or are they in distrust? What's the whole thing? That's the other thing too, to your point, Nathaniel. They could be with the intention of wanting to buy, but somebody just cut them off in the parking lot and now they're triggered and pissed. It doesn't matter what the intention was of why they were going there. If they walk in and something just happened to put them in a threat response, it changes the whole dynamic. So how we listen is important. Go ahead.
I'm gonna really throw you off here.
Okay.
I have to do it. It's just how we roll for the last 20 years.
Yes.
So something that I came across, I'm not sure if you heard the term, was conversational narcissism. Have you heard that term before?
No, but I'm intrigued.
It's fascinating. Conversational narcissism, because you're talking about when you're asking somebody a question, but you're maybe not fully listening because you're thinking about the next question. And in some cases, conversational narcissism is steering the conversation back to yourself.
I got
But as soon as I heard that conversation, because nobody wants to think of themselves as a narcissist, right? So obviously I have a propensity to talk too much. So I think of myself, gosh, when I'm asking a question to somebody, I've got to be careful that I'm not formulating conversational narcissism because I don't want to interrupt the flow of the conversation like I'm doing with you sometimes, asking the next question because I'm thinking of the next question. So kind of an interesting paradigm you bring up because people can, the fact that you even have that term, I think has a
Yeah,
trigger response, right? Interesting, right? Thought you might find that fascinating.
I like it. I'm going to end up doing research on it and probably build out a whole thing. But conversation, what it sounds like conversational narcissism is people have a tendency when they're engaged in conversations is they make everything be about them. So they bring it back to them. I was talking to this woman. She was talking to me about this reality show called Temptation Island. And I was like, I have no desire to watch. Like that's not my thing. And she sends me a clip. And the concept is these four couples come and they get separated and the four guys get surrounded by 12 hot women and the four women get surrounded by four hot guys, and they're trying to prove that they can resist the temptation, which my initial thought was, if you need to prove that in this dynamic, there's something else like vastly going on. But what I find fascinating is they once a week they end up having these bonfires and they get to see clips on how their partner is behaving, and the whole journey starts being this personal development. And so they go there with the intention of, prove to me that you can resist temptation. And then they start looking at themselves in terms of how they show up as a partner. So I was completely hooked. Um, I could talk. You know what I want to do? You know how they have like book clubs? I want to have a binge club where I dissect some of these reality shows. There was one that was like they were out in the woods. Oh, it was so good. I really want to do that. Anyways, um, now I lost my train of thought. What,
We were
what?
talking about we were talking about listening and conversational narc because we were talking about the
I
topic of
just stopped
careful
listening.
listening and then and shifting the dynamic and the paradigm because I think we're back on questions and really making sure that we're properly listening and not. I love
Oh,
what you
I
said
got it.
about
I
not
got it.
following the
So,
script. Yeah.
so I texted my friend and I was like, freaking love the show. Could not wait to talk to her about all the insights I had, right? She picks up the phone, she immediately calls me. I start chuckling and she starts telling me what she think is going on with the dynamic. I have, 20 plus years in coaching. I have a PhD in human behavior. I'm looking at it differently. And immediately in that conversation, I felt this tension. And I stopped and I was like, what is this tension? And I was like, am I just wanting to be heard? Am I wanting to be right? Like, why is there this tension? And I realized she wanted me to validate her opinion. So every time I tried to talk, she would interrupt me and tell me her thoughts. And I wanted to elaborate on them. And I remember saying, okay, but just listen, just listen. Like I really felt like she wasn't listening to anything I was saying. And then when I hung up the phone, I reflected on it, like why was that a disconnect? And was conversational narcissism is she wanted my validation that given all my experience, that I would see it the way that she saw it. And so if I had even a slightly different opinion, she didn't want to hear it. She wanted me to validate hers. And it felt horrible. And I don't want to talk to her about the show anymore. So it tells you where that goes.
Great example.
I can't- I got derailed with the show. So if you want to watch the show from that dynamic, it's quite interesting. All right. Another tactic, strategy that you can use is curiosity. It's called the double click method. So when people say something on the surface, there's usually more to it. And so instead of just taking it at face value, we want to go deeper. Double click is the concept that if we're reading something online and there's a link and we want more information, we double click on the link so we can go into a deeper dive. If we're truly focused on the other person and understanding what their needs are and what their concerns are and what they'd like to be able to create, we have to do a double click. And people sometimes confuse curiosity. Um, to your point, when I'm talking to people as leaders about being curious, they will ask loaded questions. So, for instance, if a staff member makes a mistake and the leader says, "Why did you make a mistake?" That is not true curiosity. That is a loaded question where I'm already judging you. True curiosity comes from the space of, well, what happened? I'm not judging you, I just want to understand. We fundamentally feel the difference when somebody is curious about us versus when somebody is judging us. If we come from a space of curiosity, we will naturally double click because we'll naturally want to understand and make sure that we're on the same page. So if you're asking questions, even if it's scripted or if it's formulaic, at least come from the intention of being curious as opposed to being judgmental or being, task driven. So, couple things that you'll notice if they're in a state of distrust, crossed arms, very short responses, a lot of skepticism, their tone will change. When our body is relaxed, our voice literally changes completely different. Their responses will be delayed, there'll be defensiveness, and they'll tend to distance themselves. If there's signs of trust, there'll be an openness. They'll start telling stories, which is kind of interesting because if you're in a rush and you're dealing with lots of people, and then this person wants to tell you all these stories, this happens with me at pickleball. I just want to play pickleball. I don't need to know like your whole background, but people tend to like open up to me. And it takes me a while to realize that's a huge compliment that they're very open and expressive in that moment. And so you need to see that as a sign of trust as opposed to an inconvenience or time consuming. You put some boundaries on it. They'll start asking deeper questions. You'll notice their body language is relaxed. Their language will shift. If you notice people, well, they'll say things like we, or I was thinking, or what about, or we could, right? The tone changes. It's kind of like if I meet with a potential prospect for coaching in the beginning of the conversation, it's very much like I want this, I'm looking for this, I'm looking for that. And then it begins to shift to like we. I used to notice this when I would apply for jobs and I would go on an interview. I always knew when I got the job on the interview because inadvertently the interviewer would start saying like we or when you, something like that, as opposed to the position. So when you see that collaborative language, it's a really good sign. They'll be more vulnerable. They'll start sharing what their concerns are, what they're worried about, and they'll have that emotional honesty. So if you do want kind of to change how you're asking some of these questions, the selling on the left-hand side, connection on the right-hand side. So the selling is, let me tell you why this is so great. And the connection from the curiosity is like, what matters to you? What's important to you? The selling side is like, they bring up a fear. You don't want them to get stuck in the fear. So you're like, don't worry about it. As opposed to validating it and saying, totally makes sense. Lots of people feel that way. Here's what you need to like, let's explore what it is that you really want. Focused on handling objections versus let me really understand what the concern is. Talking more versus listening more, trying to impress versus trying to understand. Fundamentally different conversation when you come from connection versus selling. So here are some conversation starters that you can go through in the beginning. Tell me what's important for you. What concerns do you have? How can I help you feel more confident? How's your experience been so far? And what are you hoping this decision will create for you? All of these are high intention, curious based questions. So the third session, we're going to talk about practicality in terms of how to get to commitment through presence and not pressure. I don't remember the date of that, June. I don't know, June sometime. Do you guys know?
June 18th, maybe?
Okay, sounds right.
June the 18th.
All right, so that will be the third session that will wrap up from praise to possibility. If you want more information from me personally, I have a site called the Light Lessons Lounge where I actually talk about emotional regulation, how to create presence, how to create coherence within yourself, all that good stuff. And so with that, I thank you all very much.
We thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate your time today. I know this is going to be recorded, so I don't know if anybody has any specific questions. I didn't see anything in the chat. Did you see anything in the chat, Melissa?
See any questions in the chat? Does anybody have a
Okay.
question before we wrap up? All right, I think we are
I
good to
think we're
go.
good. Well, Robin,
Awesome.
thank you so much. Dr.
You're
Lavich,
welcome.
thank you for your time today. Thank you to everybody here, that joined us today. We appreciate the SMC putting this together. And Melissa, we'll turn it back to you.
All right, that's about it. Thank you, everyone. We will post the recording on our YouTube channel, and then that way you can share with colleagues that maybe weren't able to attend live today. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much.